Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of Limited Level Ups. Today we're going to be covering a War of the Spark draft format breakdown. The set's coming back to Magic Arena on March 19th for a week, and that's actually a set that existed before I was making content full time, so there's currently no Limited Level Up style format deep dive. We're going to try to fix that today. If you weren't around for the first time the set came out, War of the Spark's known as kind of one of the better sets of its era, and I know it's, for a lot of people, one of the best formats, one of their favorite formats. So if you haven't played it yet, I would definitely recommend giving it a go. And if you have played it, hopefully you enjoy a bit of a refresher before you jump in this week. As always, before we jump in, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelup. So you can go there if you like the show, if you want to support what we're doing here, and if you want to unlock a bunch of benefits over there that we want to give back to you. All those benefits are all aimed at getting you better at limited magic in some way. So yeah, if you like the show and you want to support it, go check that out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All right, let's jump in. So big picture, the thing that shapes this format the most is it's a Planeswalker set. It is a set that is focused mechanically, gameplay-wise, around Planeswalkers. You're going to find a Planeswalker in every pack you open. There's like a Planeswalker slot, and there are more cards than usual that play well with or interact with Planeswalkers in the set. Now, if you haven't played the set before, and this is a thought that many people at the time had, you might be wondering, how is this not just an abject disaster? How do you balance a limited format around the idea that each player is going to have, on average, 2 or 3 Planeswalkers in their deck? And it's a few things. First and foremost, most of the Planeswalkers in this set that you're going to see are uncommons, and they're around the typical uncommon power level you might expect from an uncommon in any set. The Planeswalkers in this set actually span all 3 upper rarities, so there's uncommons, rares, and mythics, but the ones you're going to see draft and draft out most often, of course, are the uncommons. And all of the uncommon Planeswalkers have a similar template where they have a static ability, an ability that just always is kind of present, and a downtick ability. There is no +1, +2, no uptick ability on these uncommon Planeswalkers. So that's what really keeps these uncommon Planeswalkers from taking over the game. You can't just sit behind a Planeswalker and a board presence and just go, oh, uptick, 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 downtick, uptick, 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 downtick. If you can't deal with this, you just lose. No, they usually only get 2 or 3 activations out of them before they just kind of sit there. You're fine, having their passive ability just sit there, or you use their card for something else. Maybe you're proliferating onto it, or you sacrifice the Planeswalker. And this isn't to say that there aren't some really good uncommon Planeswalkers. We're going to get to that. But there's also some uncommon Planeswalkers that aren't very good. I'm going to point out something like Samit Tyrant Smasher, which is 2 Gruul Hybrid for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. It says, creatures you control have haste. That's the static ability. And it's got a -1 ability. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains haste until end of turn. Scry 1. So it's not a terrible, unplayable card by any means, but it's not a very high pick, and it's not a card that you ended up in your deck very much. There's a bunch of Planeswalkers that are kind of like this, where it's not the typical Planeswalker play pattern you might think. It's more like, okay, here's some utility. Maybe this card plays very, very well in my deck. In Samit's case, for example, you just have a bunch of big green and red smashy creatures, and you can kind of have a place there. But not all the Planeswalkers are just generically good. You have some uncommon Planeswalkers that kind of are a little more build around than others. Something like Saheeli, Sublime Artificer, which is 1 Is It Hybrid for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Static ability is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make a 1/1 servo artifact token. And the -2 is target artifact you control becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature you control until end of turn, except it's still an artifact. So you can kind of see how this is like, okay, this is for the spell deck, of course. It's not just going to be like, pick one, pack one, slam this. It's going to be awesome in every single deck. A lot of these uncommons tend to be a little more specialized. Now, a little bit of a cheat code that you can have for which ones are awesome and which ones might need a little bit of help are the ones that make tokens. The ones that downtick twice, you get 2 tokens out of the deal. Something like Tibalt Rakish Investigator. This is 2 in a red for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. The static is your opponents can't gain life. And the downtick is -2, create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So it's kind of 3 mana, puts out 2 devils. It's a pretty good deal. Another example here of Vraska Swarm's Eminence. This was one of the best ones. This is 2 Golgari Hybrid for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Static ability is whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals damage to a player or a Planeswalker, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. And then the downtick is you make a 1/1 black human assassin token with Death Touch, and also kind of like Planeswalker Death Touch. It says whenever this creature deals damage to a Planeswalker, destroy this Planeswalker. And I think here's a pretty good way to frame these uncommon Planeswalkers and how they play. With most Planeswalkers, like you take any Planeswalker in another set, the game becomes, when they come down, it's like, okay, well, if I can kill that thing, if I can manage it, then the game goes on, and if I can't, and it just is able to keep activating its abilities, I'm probably going to lose. And that really distills the game down to somewhat of like an unpleasant binary. If I can do the thing, great, the game goes on. If not, then I lose to this one card. And that's the Planeswalker experience that I think they tried to skirt around quite a bit in this set, because the minigame when you're playing against these uncommon Planeswalkers is not, well, if I can answer them, then great. If not, I lose. It's, well, can I stop them from down-ticking twice, from activating their abilities twice? And if I can, great, they only got a little bit of value off their Planeswalker. And if I can't deal with it, they get to activate their Planeswalker twice. Alright, not great for me. The opponent probably feels very good that they activated their Vraska twice and has 2 Death Touch tokens, but it's not the end of the world. I don't lose the game. I'm just a little bit behind. I would actually sort of liken these to the Neon Dynasty sagas, the ones that come in, have 2 turns of having some sort of effect, and then flip into a creature. But of course, the Planeswalkers, you can interact with them a little bit easier than these sagas. You can attack them with creatures. That's the big thing. You don't have to actually have like a removal spell in hand for them. If you're just casting a good curve of creatures, like you should, playing your 2, playing your 3, your opponent actually can't just slam their Planeswalker on turn 4 into an empty or kind of underwhelming board, because they're only going to be able to activate it once, and then maybe you cast a removal spell, kill the Death Touch token they made, kill the Vraska. Now the person who played the Planeswalker is actually a little bit behind, because they paid 4 mana for a 1/1 Death Touch. And I think that whole dynamic I just described of really making sure that your opponent doesn't get a second activation of their uncommon Planeswalkers, and kind of conversely, making sure that you are able to have a good enough board presence to get 2 activations out of your Planeswalkers consistently, is you need to be playing a 2-drop on turn 2. I know this is not a surprise. This is not something that it's like, oh wow, you have to play 2-drops in this set. The games just play out so much differently when you have your 2/2 rather than not having a 2-drop on turn 2. Because if your first play of the game is a 3-drop, well, your opponent might go, okay, kill your 3-drop, untap, play my Planeswalker onto an empty board, and then they do start to pull far ahead. So even the lowly Goblin Assailant here, 2 mana 2/2 in red, no other abilities, just straight up just flavor text, just a vanilla 2/2 for 2. This is a playable card. It's not a great card, but if you don't have 5, 6, 7 2-drops already, this is going to be the kind of card you're going to want in your 2-drop slots so you can get on board, so you can pressure your opponent's Planeswalkers and you can protect your own. And of course, as you move up the rarities, if you move to a rare Planeswalker, you are going to get a stronger Planeswalker, one that isn't exactly templated like the uncommon ones. So for example, here we've got a Johnny the Greathearted, which is 2 green-white for a rare Planeswalker. It's got 5 loyalty. 3 abilities here, a static one that says creatures you control have vigilance, a plus ability, so when you get to the rares, you get 2 plus abilities. Plus ability is +1, you gain 3 life, -2, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and a loyalty counter on each Planeswalker you control. So this is the kind of Planeswalker where if you aren't on board already, your opponent is able to just play this, sit behind some creatures, go uptick, uptick, downtick, uptick, uptick, downtick. They are going to pretty quickly win the game. And then when you go up to the Mythic level, I believe there's only 5 Mythic Planeswalkers in the set, but this is the full 3 abilities that you're used to, a plus, a minus, and then an ultimate, plus a static ability as well. So Liliana, Dreadhorde General, which is one of the top 3 cards in the set. This is a 6 mana, 4 black Mythic Planeswalker, 6 loyalty. Whenever a creature you control dies, you draw a card. That's the static ability. +1, you make a 2/2 zombie token. -4, each player sacrifices 2 creatures, which of course means they sack 2, you sack 2, but then you draw 2 cards. And -9, each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. So this is just your classic, yeah, awesome bomb Planeswalker. The rares, a little bit less so, but still pretty strong. Like I said, most of the time, though, it's going to be an uncommon Planeswalker with the uncommon kind of play pattern that you're going to have to deal with draft in, draft out. And of course, there's more cards in the set that are designed to help you combat all these Planeswalkers running around. So something like Vraska's Finisher, which is 2 and a black for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy a target creature or Planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So this is just a nice way to say, all right, I send my 1/1 flyer at your Planeswalker, Finisher comes in, kills that. Nice little variant on this kind of card that we usually see, you know, in sets from time to time, just the kind of finishes off a creature. But this one actually is pretty good. Usually these cards are not fantastic. Vraska's Finisher was one of the better kind of effects like this because it could finish off a Planeswalker, and the body's not terrible. 3 mana, 3/2. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are more cards that are designed to interact well with Planeswalkers in this set. And specifically, once you get your uncommon Planeswalkers down to that 1 loyalty spot where they can't activate their abilities, they're kind of just sitting there maybe their passive is really good, maybe their passive kind of sucks and you don't really care about that, but there are still things you can do with those Planeswalkers that have kind of run out of juice. So in the Bant colors, in blue, white, and green, you get Proliferate, which if you haven't seen Proliferate, it's just a mechanic that says whenever you proliferate, and sometimes this is on Enter the Battlefield, sometimes you'll have spells that just have Proliferate tacked on, but when you proliferate, you choose any number of permanents or players, and you put a counter that they already have. So if they have a +1/+1 counter, or of course with Planeswalkers, that's loyalty counters, you can put an additional counter on. So you put a counter on your Planeswalker that's got 1 loyalty, put it back up to 2. Usually that's good enough for 1 more activation. You know, going back to Vraska, go down tick, make an assassin, down tick, make an assassin. If you then proliferate past that, you get to make 1 more. And then black and red take a slightly different approach. So there, instead of, proliferating and bumping them back up, you get to sacrifice your Planeswalkers that are just kind of sitting there. So something like Heartfire, which is 1 in a red for an instant, as an initial cost, you can sacrifice a creature or a Planeswalker. It deals 4 damage to any target. Or something like Spark Reaper. This is 2 in a black for a 2/3 creature. It's got the ability 3, sacrifice a creature or a Planeswalker, you gain a life and you draw a card. And these kind of cards, these black and red, you can sacrifice your Planeswalkers for effect, or the Proliferate cards, that further incentivizes you getting on board early, getting a good roster of creatures on the battlefield, so that you are able to take out a Planeswalker sitting at 1 loyalty, so they don't get to then proliferate on it on a future turn, or sacrifice it for value. You do still want to get those things off the battlefield. And then just a really small note here, the removal in this set is quite strong. It was really noted at the time as very strong removal. It's about on par with the removal we get these days, but you do have to be careful because some of it hits Planeswalkers and some of it doesn't. So something like Jaya's Greeting, 1 in a red for an instant, it deals 3 to any creature, scry 1. You might think, okay, maybe you can kill Planeswalker with this until you read it and go, okay, no, you can't. Something like Heartfire, like I just mentioned a second ago, sack something, deal 4, that one can hit Planeswalker. So if you're playing the set for the first time, or if you haven't played the set in 5 years, it really would benefit you to look at your removal spells and go, okay, this one can hit Planeswalkers, this one can't, because I know we all know that situation where you're planning a turn and you go, oh, this can hit, oh no, it can't hit that, or you're like, oh, it's an instant, no, it's a sorcery. And that kind of thing can definitely happen if you're planning to use a removal spell to like finish off a Planeswalker, so just be aware of that. So since Planeswalkers are such a large focus of this set, I thought it was worth the time going through all of the uncommon ones and just kind of putting them into tiers of how I see them, how good they are. Tier 1, we've got the just great slam dunk Planeswalkers. When you see these early in the pack, you should just take them. Tier 2, we've got good utility, but not just slam dunks. Tier 3, we've got kind of more niche utility, good in some decks, but not just generically great. And Tier 4, the ones that are extremely niche or just, I think you probably shouldn't play these ones. So in Tier 1, we've got 6 Planeswalkers, and 4 of the 6 Planeswalkers do fall under that camp of the thing they do is make 2 tokens over the course of 2 turns. They start on 5 loyalty, they down tick twice, they make some tokens. And I think the best of the bunch, the best uncommon Planeswalker is Kasmina, Enigmatic Mentor. So this is 4 mana, 3 and a blue for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Her static ability is really good. It spells your opponent's cast that target a creature or Planeswalker you control cost 2 more to cast. So basically, your creatures and Planeswalkers have ward 2, and that's really strong. Her down tick's also quite strong. -2, you make a 2/2 blue wizard token, then you draw a card and then discard a card. So just a great deal all around, and this one's actually even splashable. Kasmina only costs 3 and a blue, and a lot of these other ones are double costed. Then we've got Tybalt's Rakish Instigator. This is the red one that makes devil tokens we talked about a few minutes ago. We've got Vraska, the one that makes assassin tokens. Then we've got Angrath, Captain of Chaos. This is 2 Rakdos hybrid for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker, so 4 mana for 5 loyalty. Static ability is creatures you control have menace, and then the -2 is Amass Zombies 2, which is very much like Amass Orcs if you played Lord of the Rings. And if you haven't seen Amass before, don't worry, we're going to get a little bit deeper into it in a few minutes. But basically, it makes a 2/2 token and, can make a future 2/2 worth of stats later. So this is just the core of, these are great. You're going to want to take these highly. They're also very flexible in a lot of ways because Angrath and Vraska are hybrid cards, so they go in almost every deck you're going to draft. Like, for example, Angrath isn't going to go in, like, green-white, sure, but if you take this card early, it's pretty hard to end up in a deck where you just can't cast the card. And then we've got 2 more in this Tier 1 of just awesome Planeswalkers that uncommon that aren't quite the same as the last ones we looked at, where they just make tokens, and that's kind of the game you're playing with them. Kaya, Bane of the Dead, which is 6 mana, 3 Orzhov hybrid, 7 loyalty. Her static ability is basically your opponent's things can't have hexproof, and her -3 is exile target creature. So if you can play her, exile something, have her survive the next round, exile something again, you're going to pull really ahead. Of course, it's 6 mana, but you're getting your money's worth for 6 mana. And then Narset, Parter of Veils. This is one that if you are at all tuned into the world of Constructed, you probably are familiar with. This is 1 blue for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. It says each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. And this is such a innocuous but extremely impactful effect that you just wouldn't think about it coming up as many places as it would. And of course, you know, just the typical, okay, your opponent can't cast draw spells, just those are just blank cards in their hand, but even stuff that has, you know, draw a card and discard a card on it. Something like Kasmina, we just mentioned a second ago, the one that makes 2/2 tokens and draws a card and then you discard a card when it enters. Well, if you activate Kasmina's ability, it's not even going to tell you beforehand. It's going to be like, all right, make a token, draw a card. Nope, can't do that, but you have to discard a card still. So really, really punishing. Something like Honor the God Pharaoh, for example, 2 and a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this, you discard a card and you draw 2 cards and amass zombies 1. So this just completely turns off. You know, it's definitely the kind of thing where it induces a lot of shame scooping, where you cast one of these into a Narset and go, wow, I feel like an idiot. I should just concede here. So just do make sure that when you're casting your cards, when you're activating your abilities, your opponent's Narset isn't going to ruin your day, because it does come up in a lot of spots that you wouldn't initially intuitively think that Narset's ability does come up. But that's just the static, right? That's just the static ability. Sits there, stops your opponent from drawing additional cards. It also has a -2 ability. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can take a non-creature, non-land, put it into your hand. So the general play pattern with this is it downticks twice, and then it just kind of sits there, and your opponent has to devote a lot of resources to killing it, or else a lot of their cards just don't really work. Then we move into tier 2 here, and these are the good utility Planeswalkers. I think the most generically good one of the bunch here is Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. Static ability says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davriel deals 2 damage to them, and it's -1. Target player discards a card. So if you can protect Davriel, if you're getting on board early, you cast a 2-drop, you're on the play, you cast this as your 3-drop, and then the future turns you're just protecting it. It's a 3 mana, your opponent discards 3, or 3 mana, your opponent discards 2, and this sits down pinging them for as long as Davriel's on the board. This is one that gets quite a bit better with Proliferate, because every single Proliferate is a full activation, just because it's a -1. Davriel's also one that if it's just down tick and your opponent kills it, you're not that happy about it. So it's not just like slam dunk, oh, is amazing. I would take this card fairly early still because I think it's a strong card. But unlike some of the Planeswalkers that protect themselves, the ones that create tokens, you do need a good board presence to make Davriel, you know, kind of hit its full potential. Then we've got Saheeli, which is the is it uncommon here. 1, is it hybrid? Is it a hybrid? 5 loyalty. We covered this one a few minutes ago, but the static ability is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make a 1/1 colorless servo artifact, and then -2 is one of your artifacts becomes a copy of another artifact or creature until end of turn. And this card is kind of the same as Davriel, although you also need kind of the deck building setup of making sure you've got 9, 10, 11 non-creature spells so you can trigger it quite a few times. It's actually got a pretty large range of how good it can be, because if your deck just can't trigger it all that often, it's going to do close to nothing. But if your deck is maybe in the closer to 13, 14, 15 spells, it's going to be fantastic, right? It's going to make 1, 2, maybe even sometimes 3 of these servos each turn. And this is one that you don't activate the down tech very often. It kind of just sits there as a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Generally, what you want to do is just play this on turn 3. You're not even going to have a reason to activate it very often. And then protect it, cast removal spells, cast blockers, and it kind of just turns it onto servos. And then at the end of the game, maybe you have a really good creature, a big flyer. You turn one of your servos into a flyer. You kill your opponent a turn sooner than you might have otherwise. Jaya, Venerated Fire Mage. This is 4 and a red for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. The static ability is if another red source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage +1 to that permanent player instead. So basically all your red creatures get a virtual +1, all your removal spells deal 1 more damage, and she has a -2 ability. Jaya deals 2 damage to any target. So it kind of just picks up some stuff, can go to face. Worth noting, of course, that the static ability does not affect this ability because it says if another red source you would control. So she's pretty good. She gets to kill 2 things or hit your opponent's face and then kind of buff your board, make your spells a little bit better. And of course, the more red you have in your deck, the better Jaya gets. Last one for this tier is Ob Nixilis the Hate Twisted. This one was a bit of a sleeper, one that I even think by the end of the format back in the day, people didn't really catch on to this being a good card. I was a big fan of Red-Black Sacrifice. That was kind of my my go-to deck in this format, and Ob plays very well in that kind of deck. So Ob is 3 black for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Static ability is whenever an opponent draws a card, Ob deals 1 damage to that player. Down tick, -2, destroy target creature. its controller draws 2 cards. So this one has a bit of a more variable play pattern. Generally, you want this to come down, you sacrifice one of your small little tokeny things, maybe an Amass token, you draw 2 cards, this still sits there as a 3 loyalty planeswalker that starts pinging your opponent, and then as the game goes on, as you get closer to killing your opponent, you're just going to target your opponent's stuff some amount of the time, right? Kill their thing, get a blocker out of the way, they draw 2 cards, they take 2 damage, you get in a big hit, and then this Ob Nixilis might just stick around pinging them to death. So you definitely do need to be in a sacrifice heavy deck, a deck with a lot of fodder. You don't want to just be going like, kill your thing, let you draw 2, kill your thing, let you draw 2. That's not a great exchange if your opponent's still like 15, 16 life, of course. But if you are in a deck that can consistently, this comes down, you sacrifice something, get some value, and then your opponent's pressure to turn their stuff sideways. And that's kind of a little wrinkle, right? When you're playing an aggressive leaning planeswalker, sometimes you don't need to protect them at all costs. Because if your opponent needs to turn their creature sideways, they need to get rid of blockers to deal with your planeswalkers, that opens up the window for you to attack them back. And Ob Nixilis puts them in a kind of a tough spot. Because if they do just let it go, well, it's going to ping them every single turn, maybe even more than once per turn if they have a card draw heavy deck. And if they do want to kill it, they have to turn their stuff sideways. So definitely a pretty solid card if you could enable it. All right, now we move into tier 3, which is kind of the same as tier 2. It's these utility value planeswalkers, but they're a little more niche in their applications, or maybe need some help to really reach their full potential. So first one here is Ashiok Dream Rendered. Ashiok was definitely a contentious card back in the day. There's some people being like, oh, it's one of the best ones. Some people are like, no, it doesn't do anything. One Dimir Hybrid for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Static ability is spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. So that doesn't come up very much. There's like maybe a few cards that really you can get your opponent on. The negative one is target player mills 4 cards, then exile each opponent's graveyard. So if you can downtick Ashiok for its full value all 5 times, you get to mill your opponent for 20 cards. Is that a good thing? Well, it really depends on if you're good at milling the rest of the cards in their deck. So if you can mill 20 cards and plus, you know, around 10 cards that they're going to draw out through the course of a longer game where Ashiok might be, you know, in a blue-black controlling deck where you're able to really take advantage of this ability, then yeah, you can kind of start to see, okay, I can make this an actual win condition. But I don't think you want to directly just rely on Ashiok. But there's definitely a big risk of Ashiok just doing nothing, because even in those spots where you have a slower deck and you're able to activate Ashiok 3, 4 times, because remember, your opponent can't still attack it, cast a removal spell, and then you cast it and kind of done nothing. It kind of has to go the full distance. So what I would really recommend is if you are in a spot where you have a controlling deck with Ashiok, you want ways to reuse the Ashiok. So there's black spells that buy back planeswalkers from the graveyard. Or there are a few ways to pick up creatures and planeswalkers from the battlefield once they've gone down to loyalty, pick them back up, cast them again. So if you do find yourself in a spot where you want to do the Ashiok thing, or find yourself in a spot where like you're a slow controlling deck with not a lot of great ways to close the game and you think Ashiok might fill that role, I would say it fills that role all right. But you do really have to make sure that you can recur it, you can bounce it, you can pick it up some way. You're not just relying on, all right, I'm going to play this, hope it sticks, hope it gets to the full 20, because even sometimes getting to the full 20 won't be enough, right? Your opponent will be able to kill you with like 5 cards in their library or something. So this has to be a real focus, a real centerpiece of what you're doing if you want this to be an effective card. Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. This is another one that pops up in Constructed from time to time. This is 2 and a Simic hybrid, so 3 mana for a 7 loyalty planeswalker. Static ability is whenever a creature power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card, and she's got a -1 to untap target permanent. So very clearly here, she needs to be in a deck with a lot of 4-power creatures. I'd really aim for, 8, 9. If you can draw 2 cards off of Kiora, then she makes some mana or untaps a big creature so you can block with that big creature. She's kind of done her job, but you really do need to make sure you're triggering her at least once, and hopefully 2 or 3 times if you can really get her going. But she is effective. She is good in that kind of like green, big creature style deck. Pretty good with Proliferate, because each time you proliferate, it kind of makes a mana, quote unquote, because it's 1 more untap. It is pretty difficult, I think, to get to that number. Like, red-green in this set is the 4 power matters archetype. Like, it has that theme going on. But even still, it's not just trivial to get to like 8 or 9 4-power creatures. If you're there, though, yeah, she's a pretty good card. The Wanderer is up next, and this was also a pretty controversial one. This is 3 and a white for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Her static says, prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you or other permanents you control. So your opponent's fight spells and their burn spells just don't work anymore. -2, exile target creature with power 4 or greater. So her -2 is pretty niche. You're not always going to have a battlefield that's actually relevant. The static ability of preventing non-combat damages might not be relevant at all in the matchup, so it ranges from being great, like just coming down, killing one of your opponent's things, and maybe killing another thing the next turn. And, you know, if you're playing against a red-green deck, this card's great, because none of the removal works, then you kill 2 things. But if you're playing against, like, a blue-black deck, or even just, like, you know, any deck that doesn't have a 4-power creature on board consistently, it just doesn't really do enough. So I think you could main deck this card, and it wouldn't be that bad, but I would lean away from it. And I do think I remember at the time, this was a card that people leaned towards playing. It just misses a little bit too often to be a card that I could, you know, with good intentions, recommend you put in your deck more often than not. I kind of see it as like a 20 to 23rd playable that has a wide range. Sometimes you're going to play it and you face the decks where it's good, and you're like, great, this is fantastic. And sometimes you're going to be like, wow, I really wish I didn't have this card. Arlene, Voice of the Pack. This is 4 green for a 7 loyalty planeswalker. Her static is each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. -2 is create a 2/2 wolf token. So of course it makes 3/3 wolf token. This card's okay. It's just a little bit expensive for what you're getting with Kaya, like we mentioned a few minutes ago. That one you for sure get your money's worth, killing 2 things. Making a 3/3, and then another 3/3 hopefully if you untap, and then hopefully one more 3/3 if you can get the full value. Like if you're getting 3 3/3s, yeah, this is worth it. If you're getting 2 3/3s, okay, like, yeah, it's kind of solid, but not amazing. And there are just a lot of game states where you cast this and your opponent can attack past it or attack around it, and it just doesn't quite get its full potential. So it's a playable card. It's definitely not a terrible card by any means, but definitely one that might look a little bit better than it actually is, because 6 mana is a lot for a card that you're not always going to get the full potential out of. And then last card in tier 3 here, I almost wanted to put this in the last tier, but did want to, you know, not be as cruel to it as that, is Nahiri, Storm of Stones. This is 2 hybrid Boros for a 6 loyalty planeswalker. She's got a static ability that half of it's not very relevant. It says, as long as your turn, creatures you control have first strike, and equipped abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate. I think there's actually like no equipment in this set at all. So really it's creatures you control have first strike on attacks. And she has a -X ability. Nahiri deals X damage to target tapped creature. So her abilities sort of conflict a little bit here, right? Because the static ability is clearly an aggressive ability, but the negative ability is clearly a defensive ability. You don't really want the deals damage to a tapped creature in your aggro deck. So she really ends up being just like not great, and definitely a card that reads much better than it actually plays. Like if you're reading this card and be like, hey, it just doesn't seem that bad. It's just like a confluence of all these small factors that make it not a great card. So again, this is sort of like a 20 to 23rd card. You could play it. I would really just recommend looking to other places first though. All right, now our last tier of planeswalkers, and these are the ones that are extremely niche or generally just aren't that good. We're gonna start with Huatli, the Sun's Heart, which is sort of a weird build around that isn't that supported in this set. So this is 2 and a Selesnya hybrid for a 7 loyalty planeswalker. The static ability says each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than power. So kind of that, you know, that butt fighting ability. And -3, you gain life equal to the greatest toughness amongst creatures you control. So I could see you constructing a deck where Huatli actually does something. But this theme just like isn't really supported that much. It's not like in some formats where you could actually draft around this. I'm not saying there's never going to be a deck where I think Huatli has a place, but don't chase after this card thinking like, oh, it's a cool build around. The cards generally just aren't really there for it. Samit, Tyrant Smasher, mentioned this one at the top. This is 2 Gruul hybrid for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Creatures you control have haste, and the down tick is target creature gets +2/+1 and gains haste until end of turn. Scry 1. So a purely aggressive ability. You're never putting this in a deck that's not planning to attack every single turn, and mostly just worse than a 4-drop creature. That's kind of how I would frame it, right? If you play this on turn 4, maybe you give your 3-drop a bit of a boost, but +2/+1 isn't that great. Like, it's not like it's going to really dissuade blocks from your opponents. Your opponents are still going to be able to trade at that creature a lot of the time. And since she just doesn't protect herself and makes you want to turn your creature sideways anyways, this is then susceptible to your opponent just killing it on the crackback. And even if they don't, okay, their next creature has haste and they get to pump it again, but they didn't play a 4-drop on turn 4, right? So there's not many situations where Samit is actually just better than a creature. Next up, we've got Dovin, Hand of Control. This is 2 and a Azorius hybrid for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Static ability is artifact, instants, and sorceries your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast. -1 is until your next turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target permanent and opponent controls. So a very, very, very defensively minded ability here. You can't even be like, okay, I target your thing and I get in a good attack with my thing, because that thing you targeted just becomes a great blocker because it just prevents all the damage that would be dealt to it, kind of puts it in a bubble, right? So this is only a deck if you're like super blue-white control. Like, this is a niche playable card, 2023 playable card in an extremely defensive deck, but otherwise not a great card. Very similar here, Teo the Shield Mage. This is 2 and a white for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Static ability is you have Hexproof. -2 is create a 0/3 white wall creature token with Defender. If you are an extremely defensive white deck with maybe you're like a blue-white control deck, I could see this as a playable card, but really not one that you look at very often. And the last one here is Jang Yangu Wildcrafter. This is 2 and a green for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, and this one I really do want to call out as I think a pretty big trap. I think it looks kind of appealing, but isn't very good. Static ability is each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has tap to add a mana of any color. And -1 is put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So of course you get to turn one of your creatures into a mana dork. And the issue with this is it just isn't quite enough. It's hard to really feel like you get a card's worth of value out of it. Very often what happens is you like down tick on your 2-drop. They kill your 2-drop, attack the Jang because it only has 2 loyalty, and then it just like doesn't do anything at all. I do remember this one being one of the more overrated Planeswalkers at the time, so I would just really recommend against putting this card in your deck if you can help it. All right, let's talk about the mechanics of this set, and luckily there actually aren't that many. There's only 2 named mechanics in this set because Planeswalkers really took up a lot of the complexity points of this set. They really wanted to keep it pretty tame outside of that. So the first one we're going to talk about here is Amass, and Amass is pretty much the exact same that we saw in Lord of the Rings, if you played Lord of the Rings. And if you haven't played with anything with Amass before, we've got an example here, Lazadep Reaver. So this is 1 and a black for a 1/2. And when it enters the battlefield, you amass zombies 1. And what this means is if you don't have an amass pile, a zombie army token on the battlefield, you will make a 0/0 token and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this Lazadep Reaver, when it comes in on turns 2, basically makes a 1/1 token. But any future instances of Amass, if you've already got that 0/0 zombie army token, you won't make new tokens. You'll instead pile onto the first one. So if you play a second Lazadep Reaver, you'll, instead of making a new token, put a +1/+1 counter on your zombie army, making it a bit bigger. You're going to find Amass in the Grixis colors, blue, red, and black, and these are the strongest colors in this set. Amass was a very strong mechanic. All of the support cards around it were pretty strong. Notably, I'm going to call out 3 really important commons, some of the best commons in the set. The best common in the set, Aven Eternal. This is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 zombie bird warrior. It's got flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you amass zombies 1. So very similar to a card we saw last year, Preening Champion. 3 mana 2/2 flyer. Comes with a 1/1 friend. A little bit worse, of course. Making multiple tokens generally is better than making one and then having them stack, but still a phenomenal card. Still a really, really strong card. Palace Dismissal, another great one here. This is 1 and a blue for a sorcery. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Amass zombies 1. So you can kind of think of this as like a baby Manowar, like a 2-mana bouncer thing, make a 1/1. This can also bounce opposing Amass tokens. Back in Lord of the Rings, the bounce spells got around that. They didn't target, they had restrictions on them that wouldn't let them target tokens. This one does actually just go, yep, bounce your Amass pile, all that work you put in, now set back, and I even get a 1/1 to boot. Also worth noting, this does say return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, so you can bounce your own Planeswalker. Your own Planeswalker that is stuck at 1 loyalty to reuse it again if you want to do that. And then Toll of the Invasion is another really important one here. It says 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you take a non-land card from it, that player discards it, and you amass zombies 1. So very similar to another card that we saw in Lord of the Rings, Golem, Tormented Golem, right? This is just a smaller version of that, and the card is really quite strong. One of the things about this set is that the rares are pretty good. Being able to cast this on turn 3 and nab a good rare, or even if you don't have a good rare in hand, just nab their best card, is pretty strong. Just, these cards that affect the board while taking a card out of your opponent's hand generally tend to be pretty good. If you're playing Amass cards in your red or black deck, of course, you have the play pattern of, instead of stacking up a really big army, you can go amass 1, sacrifice it to some effect, and then amass 1 again, sacrifice that to some effect. So Amass can kind of play a dual role. It's either making you a bunch of fodder, if you can line it up, if it's a bunch of sacrifice fodder, sack the thing, amass again, sack the thing, amass again. Or you can just do the go big, I have this giant threat, you have to deal with this, and if they deal with it, alright, you start the pile again. At uncommon, there's also a bunch of lords for your Amass creatures, so things that give your Amass creatures flying, or trample, or hexproof and menace in the case of Gleaming Overseer, which is the blue-black uncommon. 1 blue-black for a 1/4. when ETBs, you amass 1, and zombie tokens you control have Hexproof and Menace. So all these cards are pretty good as well. And yeah, just general note on Amass. It's pretty hard to go wrong with it. Like, the majority of cards that say Amass on them are pretty good. There's like a 4-mana blue sorcery that just amasses 3, and that just isn't very good, of course. So definitely ones that, you know, you look and you're like, ah, it doesn't look so good. Most of them are not going to be very good, but most of them that look good are good. And then the second mechanic here, like we mentioned before, is Proliferate. And once again, Proliferate just says whenever you proliferate, you choose any number of permanents or players in the set. You're only going to be targeting permanents, and you choose any type of counter that's on that permanent and give them an additional version. So it's generally going to be a +1/+1 counter or a loyalty counter in the case of Planeswalkers. And this is a solid mechanic in the context of this set, but it's not as just generically good as Amass was. I think you really do have to have a deck that uses the Proliferate well, because you kind of can envision like, oh, this one creature comes in, proliferates, I put 3 +1/+1 counters on something and buff my Planeswalker, and it's gonna be great. More often than not, you're gonna put like a counter on something. Maybe if you're lucky, you put a +1/+1 counter somewhere and a loyalties counter on another thing that lets you activate your Planeswalker one more time. It doesn't come as easy as just casting your cards like with the Amass cards. You really do need some setup, and the setup that you need is putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures naturally, like getting that first one on your creatures, and there aren't that many awesome ways to do that. One of the best ones is Polymbright Druid. This is 2 mana for a 1/1 in green. And says when it enters the battlefield, you choose one, either put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or proliferate. So just having this be like a 2 mana 2/2 that has a counter on it is pretty valuable if you do have a proliferate heavy deck. But I would say, unlike Amass, this isn't really like a deck to strive towards. It's more like, okay, you've got a little bit of a proliferate package where you have a few cards that make +1/+1 counters. You have maybe few more Planeswalkers than average, so proliferate goes up a little bit. But it's very rare that you're like, oh, I'm just the all-in proliferate deck. I think mostly because the cards are just a little bit weaker, but just like I mentioned before, another reason being it requires a little more setup. It's not just like I cast my card and it's going to do a good thing. And of course, it does actually work quite well with the Amass mechanic, because those are +1/+1 counters. So often you might have like a blue-red deck where you have blue and red Amass cards, and then something like Contentious Plan was one of the better proliferate cards. This is 1 and a blue for a sorcery that proliferates, and you draw a card. So if you're a deck that cares about spells, you have these Amass spells, you get to grow them, you get to trigger things that care about you casting a spell. Contentious Plan can be a pretty good card there. And as Proliferate is kind of the weaker of the two mechanics in this set, or at least, you know, on the cards that it appears on, the cards just tend to be a little bit weaker. That means that green and white and blue, which are the colors of Proliferate, and mostly I'm speaking to green and white specifically here, are the weaker colors in this set. So really, if you're trying to just like frame what's good in this set, it's the Grixis stuff. Generally, it's definitely a good place to be. Black, red, blue, black, red, blue, and occasionally you'd get like a really nuts green-white proliferate deck or a blue-green proliferate deck, but it wasn't that common, and again, more pieces kind of had to fall into place. More often than not, you're just kind of cherry-picking the good proliferate cards to play well with your Amass cards, or if you do have like the nuts proliferate deck where you have all the cards that put +1/+1 counters on things, sure, you're going to value them highly there, but more often than not, it's like, all right, I've got like a black-green deck with a black Amass cards and Polymbright Druid to help me get those a little bit bigger, or maybe something like Bloom Hulk, which is a 4 mana 4/4 in green that when it enters the battlefield, you proliferate. Like, that's just a solid card, and you might snipe that in your black-green deck. All right, let's move on to talking about the colors and talking about the best and the worst colors, of course. So we're going to start with what I think is the best color in black. I mentioned before that the Grixis colors are kind of the best colors, so I'd say black is the best, then blue, then red, but in a pretty linear fashion. I think black is firmly the best for me, and then blue is a little bit less good, and red's a little bit less good. And the reason that black is so good is just the depth at common. It's kind of got so many cards that I've organized the black commons into tiers of how good they are. So in tier 1, we've got a really good removal spell here. Obnix's Cruelty. So this is 2 and a black for an instant. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. If that creature would die this turn, you exile instead. Another pretty good removal spell here, Spark Harvest, single black mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you can either sacrifice a creature or pay 4 additional mana to destroy a creature or a Planeswalker, so very relevant, and there is good sacrifice fodder in this set, so you are pretty happy to pay 1 to sacrifice an Amass token to go kill something pretty often. It's not one of those things where most of the time you're looking at this as a 5 mana removal spell. No, I think most of the time in the right deck, you should look at this as a 1 mana removal spell. Toll of the Invasion, like I mentioned before, the hand disruption spell that amasses 1 card is right up there with the best removal spells. And Lazotep Reaper, the 2-mana 1/2 that amasses 1, just a great card. You're getting 2/3 worth of stats for 2 mana, and you're really happy about that. Moving on to tier 2 here, we've got Sorin's Thirst, which is a okay removal spell. Black instant, deals 2 damage to target creature. You gain 2 life, so able to pick up most of the 2 drops, most of the 3 drops, and of course get a little bit of life in the process, which is kind of nice. Vraska's Finisher, which is the 3-mana 3/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you destroy a creature or planeswalker that was dealt damage this turn. So just another kind of fine way to interact with planeswalkers. And Spark Reaper. This one's kind of a little bit of a sleeper. Maybe it looks not as good as it actually is. This is 2 and a black for a 2/3. Has an activated ability. 3, sacrifice a creature or a planeswalker. You gain a life, draw a card. That's not a tap ability. You can just do that anytime. You can even sacrifice Spark Reaper itself. So you can, if they go to point a removal spell at it, you're like, oh man, I really have to kill that Spark Reaper because they've got a bunch of fodder on the battlefield. That thing's just going to draw them a bunch of cards. You still get your money's worth a lot of the time. They're kind of forced to cast it on this first before they cast the removal spell anywhere else. And then if you have 3 mana open, you get your card back. And then 2 cards in the 3rd tier of black commons, which are still good. Like, I'm not even mentioning the 5, 6, 7 cards that aren't very good. These are still the black cards I'm happy to have in my deck. Herald of the Dreadhorde. This is 4 mana, 3 and a black for a 3/2, and when it dies, you amass 2. And also Tidebearer Giant. So this is 6 mana, 5 and a black for a 4/5. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, lose a life. Not a complicated card, but pretty decent top end. Next up, we got the blue cards, and pretty clearly the best common, and it's the best common in the set, like I mentioned before. Best blue common is Aven Eternal. 3 mana, 2/2 flyer, comes in, amasses 1. Callous Dismissal, following it up pretty closely, the 2 mana bounce spell that amasses 1. And then Tamiyo's Epiphany. So this is 3 and a blue for a sorcery, scry 4, and then draw 2 cards. This is a really powerful card draw spell. Digging 4 and then 2 more cards to find a specific card you need. Like, you dig 6 cards deep with this if you're looking for a specific card. And even if you're not looking for a specific card, you get a lot of card selection. You do, of course, need to make sure you've got enough early game, enough 2-drops, enough early interaction to make sure that you're not just casting this into a board where you're falling way behind. But if you do have all that stuff, I'm happy to play a copy or 2 of Epiphany. Some interaction here. No Escape is a 3 mana counter spell that counters target creature or planeswalker, and if the spell is countered, you put it in exile instead, and then you scry 1. So a pretty decent counter spell variant. Pretty happy to play a few copies of this in my blue decks. Totally Lost is a 5 mana instant speed, put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. I guess, again, a pretty solid interaction spell. A little bit expensive, but this has the advantage of being the old template of these kind of cards where your opponent can't put a crappy creature that you choose to put on top on the bottom. You know, these days they kind of give you that choice. Here you get the nice upside of like, okay, well, the board's pretty stable. I like what's going on here. I'm just going to cast this on your 2-drop that's not really doing anything. You have to redraw that again next turn. That can be a pretty big setback for them. Erratic Visionary is one I want to call out as better than it looks, probably. This is 1 and a blue for a 1/3, and you can tap it and pay 1 and a blue to draw a card, then discard a card. So just blocks fine early, and then as the game goes on, helps you kind of filter through your weaker cards, filter through some lands, get some action. It's not like a super premium 2-drop, but it's one of the better ones for sure. Contentious Plan, this is the 2 mana sorcery that proliferates and draws a card, just a solid card in decks that kind of would want those kind of effects. Spellkeeper Weird is a card for the spells deck. This is a 3 mana 1/4 that you can pay 2 and tap it to sack it, return instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And Kiara's Dambreaker as a surprisingly playable 6-drop. This is a 6 mana 5/6 that ETBs and proliferates. By the time you get to 6 mana, you're often going to have, you know, a thing or two sitting around that are good to proliferate. And 5/6 actually is really, really large in this set. I remember my fair share of casting Kiara's Dambreaker and just being like, yeah, this is just way bigger than anything my opponent has. And while the removal's pretty good in this set, actually not a lot of it's equipped to deal with a 6 toughness creature. You know, we talked about Obnixis' Cruelty, the best black removal spell. Well, that only gives -5, so they have to like engage in combat first for that to actually kill the Dambreaker. All right, that's gonna bring us to red, where there's a clear best common in red as well, and Jaya's Greeting. This is the 2 mana deal 3. Scry 1. Again, only to creatures, not to planeswalkers. Then we have about 4 cards that are, you know, roughly about the same in power level. One of the things about Red's commons is, the good ones anyways, are really pointed towards like the blue-red spells deck, and, you know, to a lesser extent, the black-red sacrifice deck. But you're gonna see stuff like Spellgorger Weird, which is a 3 mana 2/2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. That's a pretty strong card in this set. Burning Prophet. This was one that was underrated for a really long time back in the day. So don't be that person. This is a 2 mana, 1/3 in red. Then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+0, and you also scry 1. So you get to churn through your deck, keep chaining spells. This will often attack as a 2/3, or, you know, maybe you have a few spells in hand. Your opponent is like trying to double block this, and you're able to kill one thing. This gets pumped. You get to eat the other one in combat. Honor the God Pharaoh. This is another one that I think was pretty underrated back in the day. This is a 3 mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this, you discard a card, you draw 2 cards, and you amass 1. So anytime you see like amass 1 on a spell-like effect, you can almost kind of evaluate it as a 1/1 creature that has a good enter the battlefield effect. And I think that's kind of how you want to see Honor the God Pharaoh here. Like, just imagine going Burning Prophet into Spell Gorger Weird into Honor on turn 4, or maybe on turn 5 with a 2-drop or something like that. It's just a really nice curve. Chandra's Pyrohelix, another good interaction spell. 2 mana for an instant, deals 2 damage as you divide it among any number of targets. So often what's going to happen is you either pick off a 2 or 3-drop with this, or sometimes you get really lucky, you're able to like kill a 2-drop, like a 1-toughness 2-drop, and finish off a Planeswalker or kill a token. Then we have some cards that are pretty good in the sacrifice deck. So Heartfire, one I mentioned before, 1 red instant as an additional cost to cast it. Sacrifice a creature, it deals 4 damage to any target. Oh, sorry, sacrifice a creature or a Planeswalker. So a way to make use of those 1 loyalty Planeswalkers. And then Grim Initiate, single red mana for a 1/1 first strike. When it dies, you amass 1. So pretty good sacrifice fodder. And then another one that was pretty underrated back in the day, Blind Blast. So this is 2 and a red for an instant. It deals 1 damage to target creature, and that creature can't block this turn, and you draw a card. So pretty good in the spells decks, just like a cantripping spell. And I was actually looking at some stats on 17 lands in preparation for this episode, and this is a card that War of the Spark's been online once or twice before, and it doesn't even have enough data to be represented in the stats. So this is a card that people definitely were underplaying back in the day, and even underplaying when the set came back on Flashback. So not a card you're going to load up on, but the first copy is going to be good in any red deck. Now we're going to move on to the weaker colors in the set, green and white. And I think just going through the commons kind of shows why the colors aren't very good. There's not that much depth at common, and even among the quote-unquote good cards at common, they're not as good as some of black, red, or blue's commons. So the best green common, I believe, is Bloomhulk. This is the 4 mana 4/4, enters the battlefield, proliferate, really big. You know, War of the Spark came out long ago where 4 mana 4/4 was still like, oh yeah, that's pretty impressive. So this is just like a good, well-stated creature with a good enter the battlefield effect. Pollenbright Druid, this is the 2 mana 1/1 that when it ETBs, you either proliferate or put a +1/+1 counter on something. Banded together as just like a fine removal spell. 2 and a green for an instant, up to 2 target creatures you control each deal their damage to another target creature. So kind of 2 things gang up on 1 thing. Again, this cannot hit Planeswalkers. This is only a creature damage spell. Giant Growth is in the set. Single green mana, +3/+3. You know, always going to be a fine card. And another creature to call out here, Arlen's Wolf, as a not super impressive card, but one that's going to make your deck, I think, a little more often than not. This is a 3 mana 3/2 that can't be blocked with creatures power 2 or less. In general, evasion tends to be reasonably good in this set, just so you can pressure those Planeswalkers even on a somewhat crowded board, and Arlen's Wolf is just fine at doing that. Now, one thing that green is reasonable at doing is being the base of like a splish splashy 5-color deck. Green-black in this set is, its archetype is multicolor, and so if you are kind of there, 2 cards I'd call out, New Horizons, 3 mana enchantment aura. You put it on a land, and that land taps to add 2 mana of any one color. So it actually does help you fix for bombs that are like 3 white in your black-green deck. Like, this can actually help cast those if you have enough of those. And then Centaur Nurturer. This is a 4 mana 2/4. When it ETBs, you gain 3 life, and it taps to add a mana of any color. So these aren't just like generically good cards. You're not just going to play these, but if you are doing the multicolor stuff, they're fine role players. And that's going to bring us to what I think is easily the worst color in the set, which is white. I think that white is bad enough that you shouldn't draft it without good rares. Like, it is imbalanced enough to the point where it's just like, there's just not enough good white commons to go around. I've got like 8-ish cards here in front of me that I'm going to talk about, but very, very few of them are cards I'm actively like, yes, get this card in my deck. It's more like, all right, I opened a God Eternal Ketra, which is one of the best rares in the set, and it's a good white mythic. Like, these are the cards I can fill my deck out with, but the majority of these aren't very good. And one of the big problems is that white's aggressive cards, the cards that are aimed at being aggressive, are really bad. And so the only thing you can really do effectively with white is be kind of a slower deck. I mean, there are some white cards that can support an aggressive plan fine. Like, I'm not saying there's nothing at all. But unlike some sets where you can kind of just piece together a good white aggressive shell with just the commons, that doesn't really exist here. And in a kind of a case in point, Trusted Pegasus which is 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer in white. And when it attacks, target attacking creature gains flying until end of turn. This is the kind of card that would be a great card in a lot of sets if white had a good aggressive plan. But it's merely like okay and doesn't really fit most of what white's game plan wants to do, because you're just not all about turn your thing sideways. You're a little bit more about just like build up a board presence, have some okay removal spells, protect my planeswalkers. I think that blue-white control / blinking is actually one of the better white decks, especially because there's a rare called Time Wipe, which is like a field wipe that you can pick up one of your creatures when you cast it. So it's a really good incentive to being a slower white deck. There's like red-white aggro, which is not a deck I would really suggest drafting. Again, the white cards just don't do that well in that kind of deck. There's like a slower black-white kind of grindy deck you could draft, or if you pair it with green, maybe you do go really far down like the proliferation +1/+1 counter stuff. Then you have a few cheap flyers that are good to put counters on. So there's stuff you can do with white, but you kind of have to finagle your way into it. You're going to have to make homes for the commons. So let's just start with the actual great one. There's an actual really good white common, and that is Law Rune Enforcer. It's not like a busted common or anything, but it is solidly the best white common. Good in aggressive decks, good in slower decks. Single white mana for a 1/2, and has 1 tap it. Tap target creature with mana value 2 or greater. So you can't tap down 1-drops, but that's okay. You're not likely going to want to do that. But you also can't tap down Amass tokens. That's kind of the joke here, right? It's not able to lock down your one giant Amass thing. Your opponent has to deal with it some other way, but it's still a really good card. Past that, you really start to struggle. Like, you got 2 2-drops here. A Murder for the Cause, which is a 1 and a white 2/2. Then when it dies, Proliferate, and War Screecher, 1 and a white 1/3 flyer that has an ability 6 mana and tap it. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Like, these are playable because you need 2-drops, but they're nothing really exciting. And then you get to 2 kind of unexciting removal spells. Divine Arrow, 2 mana instant, deals 4 damage to target attacker or blocker, and Wanderer's Strike, which I think is the better of the bunch here, 5 mana sorcery, exile target creature, then Proliferate. Like, these are okay, and again, they can support that kind of slower game plan, but they're not premium at all. And then one of white's better commons, honestly, is Enforcer Griffin. This is a 5 mana 3/4 flyer. Like, it blocks reasonably well. Evasion in the air is good in this set, again, to pressure planeswalkers, but also the boards can get a little bit stally sometimes. So this is one that don't overlook. It's not exciting, but certainly can fill out your deck just fine. And then I did want to call out the collect-em-all of this set, Charmed Stray. This is a single white mana 1/1 lifelinker. Then when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control named Charmed Stray. So to really make a good Charmed Stray deck, you need, I would say, 5 at a minimum, because if you just draw these as like 1 mana 1/1 lifelink and never draw another one, even if you just draw 2, I think you really have to draw 3 of these to be happy with it. Then, you know, you're really getting the train going. But anything below that, it's not acceptable. So you need to see above average number of Charm Strays. If you're doing it and you get to 6 or something, all right, it can actually be a pretty good thing. You also then want to support this, of course, with Proliferate cards, so you can really start to go off. This is a creature, and these are rare in this set, a creature that naturally puts a +1/+1 counter on itself. So that is something you can lean into, but I would say don't get too enticed if you've only got 3 or something. I would just leave those on the sideline if you don't end up with that like minimum 5 of these Charm Strays. All right, just a quick rundown of some of the key archetypes. Like I've been talking about as this episode's gone on, I really do think you want to lean towards the Grixis side of things. Black, blue, red, black, blue, black. They all sort of have a bit of a different flavor to them. Red, black is focused on sacrificing. Blue, red is focused on spells. Blue, black is a little bit more focused on the amassing tokens, although all 3 of these colors have a lot of amass throughout their colors. And like I mentioned, amass is just a strong mechanic, so that's where a lot of the power lies. Let's just talk about blue-black quickly. Blue-black gets 2 really good uncommons. It gets Gleaming Overseer, 1 blue-black for a 1/4, and when it enters ETBs, you amass 1, and zombie tokens you control have Hexproof and Menace. Also gets Tyrant Scorn, great interaction spell here. Blue-black for an instant, and you can choose one. You either destroy target creature with mana value 3 or less, or you bounce a creature. It's a nice combination of 2 mana, kill a cheap thing, or bounce a big thing, or bounce an amass token. Red-black up next, and like I mentioned, this is my my pet deck from back in the day. Mayhem Devil. This one's such a sicko. So this is another one that you might be familiar with if you pay attention to Construct at all. This is 1 black-red for a 3/3. Whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target. So note, that's any player. That's not just you. You get pings. That's your opponent. So the mirror match of red-black gets a little bit funny. And if somebody ever resolves a Mayhem Devil and it goes unchecked, the other person's deck kind of just doesn't work because you just start to get, throw pings around, but a really strong payoff for sacrificing. And you have an okay removal spell here in Angrass Rampage, red-black for a sorcery. You choose one, either target player sacks an artifact, target player sacks a creature, or target player sacks a planeswalker, and of course, works kind of nicely with Mayhem Devil because you make them sack something, you also get a ping. Blue-red's kind of funny because it gets the best of the golden commons in the set in Rouse Outburst, which is 2 red-blue for an instant. It deals 3 damage to any target, and then you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, one in the graveyard, just phenomenal removal spell. It also gets what's probably the worst golden common, Invade the City, 1 blue-red for a sorcery. Amass Zombies X, where X is the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So it just does too little for too long, basically. Even if you have a deck that's got 13, 14 spells, what's going to happen with this is, like, okay, you can't cast this early on, of course, and then maybe you cast, 3, 4 spells, and you get, like, a 3-mana 4/4 on turn 5, 6, maybe? Like, it just isn't good enough. It just is a little bit too awkward, a little bit too small for too long. So that's the Grixis stuff. And then the other 2 decks that I do like drafting quite a bit are black-green multicolor stuff. Leyline Prowler being the headliner here. 1 black-green for a 2/3 Death Touch lifelink that taps to add a mana of any color. So just really strong mana creature. And Death Sprout. 1 black-green for an instant, destroy target creature, and search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped. So, of course, both of these help fix your mana, and often when I draft green, it isn't always exactly black-green multicolor, but I'm drafting green as a multicolor deck more often than not, just because I think green's other themes don't really work that well. Like, the green-red 4 power matter stuff's, like, okay. The green-blue proliferate stuff is fine. Green-white proliferate, also kind of fine. So I think what you want to do with green a lot of times is just play all the best cards, right? Use the fixing in green, use these 2 cards specifically are really strong fixers just to pick up all the good rares. There are a lot of good rares in the set floating around, and a good number of them are splashable, so that's kind of the space I like to be when I'm in green. And I did want to call out a white deck just to make sure we talk about a white deck here and there, and that's blue-white. I talked about Time Wipe a few minutes ago. This is a really strong field wipe, 2 white-white-blue for a sorcery. Return a creature you control to its owner's hand, then you destroy all creatures. We've got Dovin's Veto at uncommon here, blue-white for an instant. It can't be countered, and you counter target non-creature spell, so basically an uncounterable negate, which is not too bad in a set with Planeswalkers. And a really, really good uncommon that blue-white gets here, Elite Guard Mage. 2 blue-white for a 2/3 flyer. Then when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. I do think this is the best home for the white commons, this blue-white slower deck, because like we mentioned, the white cards tend to play better in a slower deck. So if you do happen to open a white bomb, or Time White specifically, I would probably lean towards blue-white as the deck you want to draft. All the other white decks just aren't fantastic. And just before we go, I have a few like odds and ends I wanted to cover here. So I want to take a look at the fixing in the set and just give you a brief overview of what the good fixing and the not so good fixing is. Like I mentioned, the green multicolor decks definitely dip into this a lot of the time. So we have Death Sprout and Leyline Prowler, the 2 black-green uncommons that we just talked about. We also have Paradise Druid, a really good mana elf here. 1 and a green for a 2/1 that has hexproof as long as it's untapped, and you can tap to add a mana of any color. Just a phenomenal 2-drop. We've got those green common fixers, the Centaur that is a 2/4, gains 3 when it enters, tap to add a mana of any color, and New Horizons, the Aura that makes your land tap for 2 mana of any one color. So those are fine if you're already there. 2 pieces of colorless fixing that are pretty solid. Guild Globe, 2 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and then you pay 2 and sack it to add 2 mana of different colors to your mana pool. And then Prismite, 2 mana for a 2/1 that has the ability to add 1 mana of any color. Not premium by any means, but if you needed to, if you need fixing, it is filtering at a cost, so you have to pay an additional mana. If you're trying to cast a 3 green-white card and you only have blue and green mana on the battlefield in the Prismite, well, you have to pay 6 mana for that, of course, but it gets the job done if you need just that additional source of fixing. There's 2 mana rocks that are not very good. Mana Geode, 3 mana artifact, ETB Scry 1, tap, add mana of any color, just super inefficient, and Firemind's Vessel, 4 mana, and just tap it to add 2 mana of different colors. If you're going like really, really hard on the fixing, like you're super multicolored, these cards are fine, but you really have to have a lot of payoffs for multicolor stuff before these pull their weight, right? If you're only splashing like a card or 2, you definitely want to try to aim for these other fixers before these artifacts. And then there's Gateway Plaza, very similar to the Public Thoroughfare from MKM. So enters tapped, and you sacrifice it unless you pay 1 additional mana. So it's like a double tap land kind of. taps out a mana of any color. Not a great fixer, very clunky, very inefficient, but it's there if you really need it. And then just a few cards I wanted to call out that I didn't really get a chance to anywhere else. Ugin's Conjurant, kind of a weird looking card. Its mana cost is X, just X. It's a colorless card. It's a 0/0, it's an uncommon, and it enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it. So it's a vanilla test crusher, right? It's just a XX for X mana. But it has the downside of if damage will be dealt to Ugin's Conjurant while it has +1/+1 counters on it, prevent that damage or remove that many +1/+1 counters. So that reads like a really large downside, but it's only a minorly bad downside because your opponent, let's imagine this is a 5/5, your opponent has a 4/4. Well, are they going to attack into this? Probably not still. Leaves you with a 1/1. Are they going to want to block this? Also probably not. So it's definitely a downside, but in practice, the way it actually plays out in the game, it's not that bad, and the card's pretty solid. Eternal Skylord. This is an uncommon 4 and a blue for a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you amass 2, and zombie tokens you control have flying. So it's just a giant preening champion, basically, right? Just 3/3 comes in with 2/2 worth of stats. Sometimes the 2/2 worth of stats, the amass, is hasty because you already had an army. So you play this, you had a 3/3 army, you know, a 5/5 flying army, and they have to deal with this or the army, and then if they deal with the army first, because that's the most pressing thing, that's the thing that's bashing them for 5, then all your other amass things start to accrue, and this becomes a problem again. So really one of the strongest uncommons. Bolas's Citadel. This is a really funny one. Fun card to play, too. 3 black, black, black for a legendary artifact. You can look at the top card of your library anytime. You can cast spells from the top of your library and play lands, and if you would cast a spell this way, you pay life equal to its mana value rather than pay its mana cost. It also has the ability tap, sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life. The way you want to think about this, either in a very aggressive deck or a very controlling deck. In a very aggressive deck, it's nice top end, you've emptied your hand, this is the last thing. Your life total is probably going to be pretty high still because your opponent wasn't able to pressure you. You're the one doing the pressuring, and you just get to cast a bunch of cards at the top of your library. And then, of course, that tap, sack, 10 non-land permanents, each opponent loses 10, becomes a real threat. It's also a wombo combo with Mayhem Devil, because if you are able to sack 10 non-land permanents, this deals 10, and then the Mayhem Devil, you sack 10 things. That's 10 pings. That has happened to me on several occasions, and worth noting, you can sack the Bull's Citadel as one of those permanents. So it's like 9 other permanents plus Bull's Citadel. Or you could play this in a very, very controlling deck, but if you're playing it in a very, very controlling deck, you have to be very conscious about your life total. Like, you know, sometimes when you're playing a slower controlling deck, you do take a little bit of early damage, save your removal for some of their more pressing threats. You don't care that much about the 2-drops, but every life point matters when you have a Citadel in play or a Citadel in your deck, so you really have to make sure that you can either gain life or are very, very good at not dying early. Maybe you have some Sorin's Thirst, right? The black, deal 2, gain 2. Or there's a 6-drop. It's like a white 6-drop, maybe like a black-white control deck. Bulwark Giant, I think it's called. It's 6 mana for a 3/5. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life. So there's some stuff you can kind of engineer, but I do see Citadel a little bit more as an aggressive card than a controlling guard. This works a little bit better when you're the one doing the pressuring. Then we're going to end on a dishonorable mention here. D-Spark. Black, white for an instant. Exile target permanent with mana value 4 or greater. And this card kind of looks very appealing, right? 2 mana, kill a really big thing. Problem with it is that a lot of the big things in this set, the big creatures, are amass creatures. And of course, you can't kill the amass creature with this. And if you're thinking, oh, I can kill a Planeswalker, that's true, but you're always going to be down on that exchange because the opponent's always going to be able to activate their Planeswalker first. This card is not quite unplayable, but it's not that much above unplayable. So if this looks like a great card, I would probably just bump it down in your expectations of how it's going to play out. All right, and that's going to do it for our War of the Spark draft guide format breakdown. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My final piece of advice is just a reiteration of advice, and that I think if you haven't played this set before, try it out. Make sure you're playing a 2-mana creature on turn 2. Very important for pressuring and protecting Planeswalkers. And I think that's just about it. If you did make it to this point of the show, go consider checking out those benefits on Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.